Hi, this is Lindsay Mueller and Daniel Blankenship, and this is our presentation on the elicitation technique of interviewing for CS364.
So the first thing that we want to go over is what exactly is the interviewing elicitation technique. So it's considered in the book in Cleland Huang's article that it's one of the simplest yet most effective methods. And the two most important points that we could make for this is that there are two different types of interviewing. One would be structured, which is to give every stakeholder the same questions. This way you would have a consistent approach and you would be able to make sure that there are no questions that are left out for certain stakeholders and be able to see where gaps arise in understanding. You can also take an unstructured approach, which from the book, it quotes it as, you may ask a few leading questions, but then allow the interview to develop in a less rigid fashion. And also the third option would be to use both. So you could ask a consistent structured set of questions and then lead to a more open-ended response near the end. Another option for interviewing is to do it in stages. So once you've interviewed all stakeholders, then to refine the process and come back and do it again. Next slide.
So as previously mentioned, there's the two types of interviews, structured and unstructured, or also known as open-ended. And one of the main advantages of using the structured interviewing technique is that all of the interviews are asked the same question, which then ensures that important or critical questions aren't skipped over and forgotten. An advantage to the unstructured type of interview is that there's no rigid structure that has to be followed. The interviewer can develop, or the interview can develop however the interviewer would like. So the interviewer would ask a few leading questions, and then they can choose where to go based off of the responses they receive from the interviewee. And then using both, the advantage to that is that it allows the interviewer to get the most information and the most useful information from their interviewees. Another advantage is that stakeholders often have restricted viewpoints, and it's not uncommon for them to only see things their way. And often there just isn't enough resources to ensure that all stakeholders' wants are met. So by performing group interviews, this can expose stakeholders to other people's ideas and allow for a sense of what the book calls collective responsibility for the resolution, or at least so they can come to a common consensus.
Some of the disadvantages that it mentions in the articles and from the research that we did is that sometimes stakeholders will disagree, which is something that Lindsay mentioned before. If this is the case, interviews are not the best way to gain consensus among stakeholders. This means that you may want to consider another elicitation technique to supplement with your interviewing to be able to reach this consensus. It's also time consuming. It says in the book that interviews are often conducted in stages so that responses from the first round can be used to generate a deeper set of more focused questions for the second round. Sometimes this just isn't an option for smaller companies. If you don't have the time, or the stakeholders don't have the time to meet with you, or if you're on a rush deadline, this thoroughness of going through stages isn't always an option. And it also could require training to train project managers or business analysts on how to conduct effective interviews. Next slide.
So when to use? Using the interview technique is most appropriate when the project has progressed beyond trying to understand the problem and you're ready to start understanding the specific requirements of the system. A good technique to use when interviewing is to have the interviewers present so that they can pick up on things that the other one would have missed. This can also help to shorten the amount of time that it takes to get the appropriate requirements. It's also a good technique to use when you just need to establish rapport or trust with your stakeholders, or you just want to ensure that they're feeling like they're involved in the project. Interviewing is also a good technique to use when you need instant feedback on a topic or on a decision.
So interviews are not always effective, as we said before, for getting consensus. The reason behind this is that when you interview an individual, you're often going to get gaps in agreement on what exactly should be required for the system. It wouldn't be productive to bring up what someone else said in an interview or someone else's opinion and try and resolve it that way. Interviews are also not as useful when you're trying to figure out how someone uses a system or what a collective group may think about something. However, this technique can be used in certain situations to allow for a group to come together on and agree on certain things. However, one thing to avoid, which it talks about in the reading, is a scenario called groupthink, which causes people to agree in the moment, but then once they get separated, they may disagree. Next slide.
So the book states that interviewing techniques are one of the simplest yet most effective methods of requirements elicitation. However, the outcomes of the interview are largely dependent on the analyst's personality or people skills and their ability to influence people. To make interviewing more effective, you should try to learn as much as you can about the topic, and then determine what type of information the interviewee will know, and that way it will help you determine which questions to ask. You can also make sure to ask plenty of open-ended questions, because this will allow the interviewee to set the tone and direction for the interview, which will let you know what they think is most important. You should also be sure that you ask plenty of follow-up questions. These are what draws out hidden data that their interviewee's initial responses won't. And then lastly, you should listen and analyze the answers. Think about what the interviewee says, and asking for clarification to better understand will help you get the best requirements. And then be sure that you offer feedback to them so they know that you're listening and trying to understand what it is that they're saying.
So one example I thought of is inspired by an internship that I just finished up at a small company in Provo. I worked as a web developer for a marketing team primarily, and it was a little bit smaller, so this example may not apply to every size of company. So the general process would be the executive team would meet to identify a business need. In this specific example, the chief technical officer would then meet with the chief marketing officer to try and understand the technical requirements of the business need. Then a business analyst, or in this case, a project manager from the development team, would schedule an interview with the chief marketing officer. This would allow the project manager to get a better understanding of the requirements from an abstract point of view, and get a better idea of the technical needs. The project manager, once he has an understanding of the problem and the requirements needed, he could then schedule an interview with the marketing manager. This would allow him to go through multiple channels to get more of the abstract view, but then to get more of the day-to-day needs and requirements of the system. But of course, one stage, that's just the first stage of the process. And so once the project manager has refined the requirements, he would then need to go back and make sure that the CMO and the marketing manager are in agreement, and that he has an understanding of the requirements, and to fill in any gaps that he may not have gotten on the first stage. Next slide. Oh, and that would be the end of our presentation. Thank you very much.